Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, the Spanish flu of 1918. It killed more people than both world wars combined, yet until recently, hardly anyone talked about it. Kind of wild that something so deadly could just slip from our collective memory, right? Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Alright, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 1918 and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So congratulations, you just woke up in 1918. The Great War, what we now call World War I, has been grinding on for 4 brutal years. Tens of millions of soldiers have been dying in trenches across Europe. The United States entered the war about a year ago, and American troops are pouring across the Atlantic to join the fight. But there's another killer on the horizon, one that will take even more lives than the war itself. Good news, you're alive in a time of incredible progress. Bad news, medical science hasn't quite figured out viruses yet. Let's say you're waking up on a spring morning in 1918 in Haskell County, Kansas, just a typical farming community in America's heartland. You're stretching in bed as the sun filters through thin curtains. Your muscles ache from yesterday's farm work. Everything's done by hand in this era. The wooden floor is cold against your bare feet as you shuffle around, getting dressed for the day. Your throat feels a bit scratchy, probably just dust from the fields, you think. You cough once, twice. Nothing to worry about. You've had colds before. Little do you know, you might be patient zero for a pandemic that will eventually infect a third of the entire world's population. Yeah, that's right. Despite being called the Spanish flu, this disease likely started right here in America's heartland. Spain just got the blame because they were the first to report honestly about it. See, most countries were deep in World War I at this point, and war censors wouldn't let newspapers report on a devastating illness. Bad for morale, but Spain was neutral in the war, so their press could actually tell people what was happening. So here you are in Kansas, feeling a little under the weather, but it's nothing that'll keep you from your chores. The family needs to eat after all. You drink some water, wrap a scarf around your neck, and head out to tend the animals. Maybe your neighbor's son just came back from Fort Riley, a nearby military training camp where thousands of young men are packed together, preparing to ship off to Europe. He seems fine, but he's carrying something invisible with him, an unwelcome visitor that's about to change everything. Now, if you're lying in bed today in 2025, you might be thinking this sounds a little familiar. And yeah, there are some eerie similarities between what happened then and what we experienced with COVID-19. But trust me, the Spanish flu was something else entirely. When you stepped outside in Kansas that morning, the world still seemed normal. People bustling about their business, horses and early automobiles sharing the muddy roads, the mail still coming, newspapers still printing, life going on as it had for years. But inside your body and in the bodies of your neighbours, something dangerous was brewing. At first, the symptoms were like any other flu: fever, sore throat, headache. Some people got better after a few days of bed rest. But then the virus changed. By fall, it had mutated into something far more deadly. In this first wave, though, the virus was just getting started, finding its footing, learning in its own mindless way how to spread more efficiently from person to person. That tickle in your throat, within days it might turn into a raging fever that could kill a healthy young adult in less than 24 hours. Not the elderly or babies, though they died too, but young, strong people in the prime of their lives, people who should have been able to fight off a simple flu. The virus would fill their lungs with fluid until they essentially drowned, gasping for air that couldn't reach their bloodstream. Their skin would sometimes turn blue or even purple from lack of oxygen, a condition doctors called heliotrope cyanosis. Imagine watching someone you love literally turn blue as they struggle to breathe. And this was happening in a world without ventilators, without ICUs, without antibiotics to treat the secondary bacterial infections that often finished what the virus started, in a world where medical science was still developing, where doctors couldn't even see the virus that was killing their patients. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that spring morning in Kansas, where a handful of people are starting to feel sick, but no one yet understands what's coming. As you finish your morning chores, you notice your hands are shaking slightly, your head is pounding now, and despite the cool spring air, you feel unusually hot. You wipe sweat from your forehead with a handkerchief and decide maybe you should lie down for a bit after all. By the time you make it back to the house, your legs feel like lead. Your wife takes one look at you and orders you straight to bed. "You're burning up," she says, pressing a cool hand to your forehead. You spend the next few days drifting in and out of consciousness, racked with fever and chills. The local doctor comes, but he doesn't have much to offer besides rest and plenty of water. "It's just the grip," he says, using the common term for influenza at the time. "Going around a county? Nothing serious." But you're not the only one sick. Your neighbour's son, the one who visited from Fort Riley, he's down with it too. And his mother, and half the people at Sunday church service. At Fort Riley itself, on March 4th, 1918, a company cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary with a fever, sore throat, and headache. By noon, over 100 soldiers were sick. Within a week, that number jumped to 500. The virus was finding perfect conditions to spread. World War I had created massive military camps where thousands of men lived in close quarters. These young soldiers were then packed onto trains and ships, travelling across the country and then across the Atlantic, carrying the virus with them everywhere they went. So while you're recovering in your farmhouse in Kansas, the virus is already on the move, hitching rides in the respiratory tracts of soldiers bound for the battlefields of Europe. Think about how different travel was back then. No commercial air travel meant diseases spread more slowly than they do today, but the war created unusual patterns of mass movement that gave this virus exactly what it needed. Hosts traveling in large groups to every corner of the globe. After a week or so of misery, you start to feel better. The fever breaks, your appetite returns, and soon you're back in the fields, making up for lost time. The spring planting won't wait, war or no war, flu or no flu. But even as life returns to normal in your small corner of Kansas, the virus is establishing footholds in military camps across America, and then in the trenches of Europe. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, then France, England, Germany, Spain. By May, it reaches as far as India. Most people who catch this first wave survive just like you did. It's unpleasant, but for now, the death rate isn't much higher than seasonal flu. That will change, but no one knows it yet. Summer comes, and the number of new cases starts to drop. Health officials breathe a sigh of relief, thinking the worst is over. Newspapers, where they're even allowed to mention the epidemic, report that the strange outbreak of spring illness has run its course. They couldn't be more wrong. While you're harvesting wheat under the hot summer sun, the virus is quietly mutating, becoming something far more dangerous, and it's about to return with a vengeance. Let's fast forward to fall. The leaves are changing, there's a chill in the air, and the war news seems positive. Germany and its allies appear to be losing ground. Victory feels possible for the first time in years. In military camps and crowded cities, the second wave of influenza begins. This time, it's different. This time, it kills. It starts in a few port cities simultaneously: Boston, Brest in France, Freetown in Sierra Leone, places where military ships are docking, carrying not just soldiers but an invisible passenger. In Boston, the first cases appear at Commonwealth Pier on August 27th. Sailors start falling ill. Within days, the virus jumps to the civilian population. By mid-September, it's spreading like wildfire. One of the first major outbreaks happens at Camp Devens, an overcrowded military installation near Boston. The scene there gives us our first glimpse of the horror to come. A physician at Camp Devens wrote to a friend, "These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of influenza, and when brought to the hospital they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate." By the end of September, 14,000 men at Camp Devens, about a quarter of the camp's population, are sick and hundreds are dying daily. This is what's coming for the rest of America and the world. This is the real Spanish flu, not the mild first wave you experience back in spring. You're back in Kansas, reading about these distant outbreaks in the newspaper. The war news takes centre stage, of course, but there are small mentions of a severe influenza epidemic affecting the East Coast. It still feels far away, someone else's problem. Then one day, in early October, your neighbour's other son, the one who stayed home to help with the farm, develops a high fever. Within hours, he's struggling to breathe. His lips turn blue. By evening, blood is seeping from his nose. By morning, he's dead, and he's not the only one. Reports start coming in from all over the county, young, healthy people dying within days or even hours of showing their first symptoms. The local doctor is overwhelmed and, frankly, terrified. He's never seen anything like this before. The true horror of the Spanish flu was how fast it could kill. With regular seasonal flu, most deaths came from secondary bacterial pneumonia that developed days or weeks after the initial infection. But with this virus, the primary viral pneumonia could kill all by itself, sometimes within hours of the first symptoms. Victims would start with standard flu symptoms: fever, sore throat, headache. Then the virus would invade their lungs, triggering an immune overreaction. The lungs would fill with fluid, and victims would essentially drown. Their skin would turn blue or purple from lack of oxygen. First their fingertips and ears, then their faces. In the worst cases, patients would bleed from their nose, mouth, and even ears. Some coughed so violently they tore abdominal muscles. Others became delirious with fever. Many suffocated, gasping for breath that couldn't reach their bloodstream through fluid-filled lungs. And the cruelest twist: unlike most flu strains, which primarily kill the very young and very old, this one targeted young adults, people between 20 and 40 years old, in the prime of their lives. The very people who should have had the strongest immune systems. Scientists later theorized that those strong immune systems might have been part of the problem. The virus triggered a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that ended up doing more harm than good. So while children and the elderly certainly died too, it was the young, healthy adults who were at highest risk. Imagine seeing your teenage son or daughter, your spouse, your strongest farmhand turn blue and die gasping for air within days of their first sniffle. The speed was terrifying. People literally dropped dead in the streets. There were reports of people who felt perfectly fine in the morning, fell ill on their way to work, and were dead by nightfall. In Philadelphia, a woman got on a streetcar and noticed the man sitting next to her was slumped over. She asked if he was feeling all right, received no response, and realized he was dead. In South Africa, people reported stepping over bodies in the street. In India, trains would arrive at stations with dead passengers still in their seats. Back in your Kansas farm community, panic is setting in. The local school closes, church services are cancelled, people stop visiting neighbours. When you have to go into town for supplies, you tie a handkerchief over your nose and mouth, an early version of a mask, though no one's sure if it helps. The town's one doctor is making house calls around the clock, but there's little he can do besides recommend rest and plenty of fluids. There are no effective treatments, no vaccines, no antibiotics for the secondary infections, just supportive care, keeping patients hydrated, trying to bring down fevers, hoping their bodies can fight off the virus on their own. You set up a sick room in your house with your wife as the designated caregiver. If anyone falls ill, they go straight there and no one else enters except her. You've heard this might help keep the disease from spreading through the whole household. Your days become a grim routine of working the farm, avoiding other people, and anxiously checking each family member for signs of fever. Every cough, every sneeze, every complaint of a headache sends a spike of fear through your heart. The nights are worse. Lying awake, listening to the wind rattling the windows, wondering if tomorrow will be the day the flu comes for your family. The sound of coughing from a nearby bedroom is enough to keep you staring at the ceiling until dawn. In cities, the situation is even more dire. In Philadelphia, a massive Liberty Loan Parade is held on September 28th, bringing 200,000 people together in the streets, despite warnings from health officials. Within days, the city's hospitals are overwhelmed. By October 1st, the city has run out of coffins. Death carts roll through Philadelphia's streets with drivers calling, "Bring out your dead," like something from the medieval plague era. Corpses pile up because there aren't enough gravediggers to bury them. Some bodies remain in homes for days because there's no one to collect them. One Philadelphia woman, desperate to get help for her husband, carries him to the hospital herself, only to find it so crowded that patients are lying on the floor. She returns home and finds her other children have now fallen ill. When her husband dies, he remains in the house for days because there's no one to take the body away. In Washington, D.C., so many government clerks are sick that the business of running the country nearly grinds to a halt. In San Francisco, citizens are ordered to wear masks in public or face imprisonment. In Chicago, there are reports of nurses fainting from exhaustion during their shifts. The war, which has dominated headlines for years, is suddenly sharing space with news of the pandemic. But even now, many newspapers downplay the severity of the outbreak, partly due to wartime censorship, and partly because no one wants to cause panic. This is happening in a world without antibiotics, without ventilators, without most of the medical technologies we take for granted today. Doctors in 1918 didn't even know what a virus was. They could see bacteria under microscopes, but viruses were too small to detect with the technology of the time. Many still believed influenza was caused by a bacterium, the so-called Pfeiffer's bacillus. Treatment options were limited. Aspirin for fever, whiskey or camphor for congestion, mustard plasters and cupping. Doctors tried bloodletting, zinc treatments, even leeches. Nothing worked. Some treatments, like the massive doses of aspirin sometimes prescribed, may have actually contributed to deaths. Hospitals quickly became overwhelmed. There weren't enough beds, enough nurses, enough doctors. Many healthcare workers fell ill themselves. Medical students were pressed into service before completing their training. In some cities, high schools and armories were converted into makeshift hospitals. The situation was made worse by the war, which had already stretched medical resources thin. Many doctors and nurses were serving overseas with the military, leaving fewer to treat the civilian population just as the pandemic hit. But even with all the death around you, Life had to go on. Fields still needed ploughing, animals still needed feeding, meals still needed cooking. The strange, surreal experience of continuing daily life while a plague raged around you, that's something many of us can now understand in a way previous generations couldn't. And then there was the loneliness, the isolation, with public gatherings banned, schools and churches closed, even funerals limited to immediate family. The normal social connections that help people weather hard times were severed. One woman in San Francisco wrote in her diary, "Lonesome. No visitors, no phone calls, nobody walking past the house even." A man in Philadelphia described the city as a ghost town by day and a cemetery by night. Back on your Kansas farm, isolation is a way of life anyway, but now it takes on a different character. Before, you chose when to engage with others. Now others are a potential threat, carriers of invisible death. You still need supplies from town though. One morning you hitch up the wagon, or maybe you're prosperous enough to own one of those early automobiles, and make the journey. The usual bustle of Main Street is gone. Stores are open, but customers enter one at a time. Everyone keeps their distance, eyeing each other warily. The general store has handwritten signs. Do not gather here. Make your purchase and leave. Cover your cough. The shopkeeper passes your goods across the counter with a cloth over his face. You pay and hurry out, not lingering to chat as you normally would. At the post office, mail is still coming in, but the postmaster tells you 3 of his carriers are down sick. The newspaper is still printing, but it's thin, not enough healthy staff to produce a full edition. As you pass the church, you see the pastor and 2 men digging graves in the cemetery. Fresh graves, too many of them. You nod in greeting, but don't approach. They nod back, leaning on their shovels for a moment's rest, faces haggard with exhaustion. The local doctor's house has a line of people outside, all keeping their distance from each other. Some are coughing, some look feverish, some are just afraid and wanting reassurance. The doctor himself appears briefly at the door, his face grey with fatigue. He's been working around the clock for weeks now. On your way home, you pass a farmhouse with black crepe on the door, the sign of a death in the family. Last week it was the Johnson place that had the crepe. The week before, the Millers. You wonder who it is this time. When you get home, you leave your packages in the barn for a day before bringing them into the house. You've heard the virus might live on objects for a while. You wash your hands thoroughly with lye soap and change your clothes before going inside. Your wife meets you at the door, her face tight with worry. The Hendersons lost their oldest boy last night, she tells you, and the Parkers have 3 down sick. You digest this news silently. The Henderson boy was just 18, strong as an ox. Was supposed to join the army next month. Now he's gone. That night, your youngest child develops a cough. Just a tickle, she says, probably nothing, but you and your wife exchange a look of pure terror over her head. You prepare the sick room just in case, clean sheets, a pitcher of water, a basin, aspirin, and you wait, hearts pounding to see if this is just a cold or something much worse. That's what it was like, living through the fall of 1918. Constant fear, constant vigilance, constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every morning, waking up and taking inventory of how you feel. Is that a tickle in my throat? Am I warmer than usual? Is this ordinary fatigue? Or the first sign of the killer flu? And all around, the evidence that your fears were justified. The black crepe on doors, the fresh graves in the cemetery, the empty places at dinner tables all over town. This was just the beginning. By the end of October, the Spanish flu would reach almost every corner of the globe, from the cities of Europe to the remote islands of the Pacific, from the Arctic to Africa. Few places would be spared, and the virus was still gathering strength, still finding new victims. The worst was yet to come. The chill of that fall evening seeps through your bones as you sit by your child's bedside, watching for any sign that her condition is worsening. Outside, the wind picks up, rattling the windows. The lamp casts long shadows on the wall. Your wife brings tea, her face pinched with worry. Neither of you speaks the fear aloud, but it hangs in the air between you, heavy as a wool blanket. Your child coughs in her sleep, and your heart stops for a moment, but her breathing settles again. Regular, even, no sign of the desperate gasping that signals the flu's deadliest form. Maybe you'll be lucky, maybe you'll be spared, but in cities and towns and farms across America, across the world, millions of others won't be so fortunate. The pandemic is just hitting its stride, and the coming months will bring suffering on a scale not seen since the Black Death of the Middle Ages. The Spanish flu is about to change the world forever, and when it's over, when the dead are buried and the survivors try to rebuild their lives, a strange thing will happen. People will start to forget. This catastrophe that killed more people than the Great War will fade from public memory, becoming a footnote in history books rather than the defining event it truly was. Morning comes, pale light filtering through the curtains. Your child's fever broke during the night, just a common cold after all. You feel the relief wash through you like a physical wave, leaving your knees weak and your eyes damp. You've dodged the bullet this time, but all across America, all around the world, millions of others aren't so lucky. By mid-October 1918, the Spanish flu is at its peak in most American cities. The speed of the pandemic is breathtaking. In just a few weeks, it has spread to every corner of the globe, killing more people in a single month than any other illness in recorded history. In Philadelphia, one of the hardest hit cities, nearly 4,600 people die in a single week. The city's morgues can handle at most 36 bodies at a time. You can do the math. Bodies pile up by the hundreds, in hospital corridors, in makeshift morgues set up in school gymnasiums, in cold storage plants normally used for food. The smell of death was everywhere, one Philadelphia resident later recalled. With undertakers overwhelmed and gravediggers falling sick themselves, some bodies remained unburied for days or even weeks. In the worst cases, families had to dig graves for their own loved ones. The psychological impact was enormous. People who had lived through previous disease outbreaks, typhoid, cholera, even the milder seasonal flu, had never seen anything like this. The speed, the scale, the seeming randomness of who lived and who died, it shattered assumptions about how the world worked. And remember, this is happening against the backdrop of the Great War, with daily reports of battles and casualties from Europe. Death becomes an overwhelming presence in daily life, no longer something that happens primarily to the old or the very sick, but something that could strike anyone at any time. Philadelphia wasn't alone in its suffering. In Boston, police officers were called to duty wearing white masks that made them look like ghosts patrolling the streets. In San Francisco, anyone caught in public without a mask faced arrest. In Chicago, so many telephone operators fell ill that the phone system nearly collapsed. In Washington, D.C., the White House wasn't spared. President Woodrow Wilson's personal secretary caught the flu, as did the sheep that grazed on the White House lawn, used instead of noisy, fuel-consuming lawnmowers during wartime. New York City ordered staggered business hours to prevent overcrowding on public transportation. In Los Angeles, movie theaters and public gatherings were banned for 10 weeks. In Alaska, entire native villages were wiped out. In a mining camp in Bristol Bay, Alaska, 11 people survived out of a population of 600. The pandemic reached every corner of the earth. In India, at least 12 million people died. Some estimates put the number as high as 17 million. In Western Samoa, 22% of the population perished. In Iran, modern estimates suggest that between 8% and 22% of the population died. In Tahiti, 13% of the population was gone in less than a month. This was the reality of the Spanish flu at its peak, a global catastrophe unfolding in slow motion with no effective treatments and no understanding of what was actually causing it. Back in your Kansas farm community, daily life takes on a surreal quality. The familiar rhythms of agricultural work continue. Crops still need harvesting, animals still need tending, but against a backdrop of constant fear and frequent death, the local newspaper publishes lists of the ill and the dead. Each week, the lists grow longer. You scan them with dread, looking for familiar names. Too often, you find them. One morning in late October, you're chopping wood behind the house when you hear the sound of an automobile approaching, a rarity on your rural road. It's Doc Adams, the town physician, his Model T kicking up dust as he rattles up your driveway. Your heart lurches. He wouldn't come all this way unless something was wrong. Has someone fallen ill? Has there been an accident? But no, he's just exhausted, he tells you, rubbing his red-rimmed eyes. He's been driving from farm to farm for days, treating the sick, watching many of them die despite his best efforts. He needed somewhere to stop for a moment, somewhere to catch his breath. You invite him in for coffee. He hesitates. Shouldn't get too close, he says. He's been exposed to the flu 100 times over, but then his shoulders slump. Just for a minute, he agrees. At the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, he tells you what it's been like. 20 patients yesterday, 6 already dead, 2 more not likely to last the night. The Pattersons lost 3 children in a single week. Old man Granger died alone in his cabin. They only found him because his dog kept barking. I don't know what to do for them, the doctor confesses, his voice cracking. We've tried everything, aspirin, quinine, bloodletting even. God help me. Nothing works once they start turning blue. He describes walking into homes where every single family member is ill, no one well enough to fetch water or make soup. In one house, he found a 4-year-old girl trying to care for her parents and 3 siblings, all bedridden with fever. In another, a mother dead in her bed, her baby still trying to nurse. And the sounds, he says, staring into his coffee as if seeing horrors reflected there. The coughing, the struggle to breathe. Once you've heard it, you never forget it. After a few minutes, he straightens up, thanks you for the coffee, and heads back to his car. There are more farms to visit, more patients who need him, even if he can offer little besides comfort. You watch him drive away, the weight of his stories settling over you like a heavy cloak. The pandemic has always been frightening in the abstract. Now it has faces, names, specific tragedies. That night, you gather your family close. You tell stories, play cards, try to create a bubble of normalcy in a world gone mad. But the spectre of the flu haunts every interaction, every touch, every cough or sniffle. Public health officials were fighting a battle on multiple fronts. Not only were they trying to contain a disease they didn't fully understand with limited resources, they were also fighting public skepticism and wartime priorities that often pushed health concerns to the background. Some cities fared better than others. In San Francisco, decisive action by Health Officer Dr. William Hassler, including mandatory mask ordinances and the closure of all places of public amusement, helped reduce the death toll. In St. Louis, early implementation of social distancing measures made a significant difference compared to cities that waited longer. But in many places, the response was too little, too late. In Philadelphia, Public Health Director Wilma Cruzen catastrophically allowed the Liberty Loan Parade to proceed on September 28th, bringing 200,000 people together in close quarters. Within 72 hours, every bed in the city's 31 hospitals was filled. Within 6 weeks, 12,000 Philadelphians were dead. The contrast between Philadelphia and St. Louis became one of the clearest examples of how public health interventions could make a difference. St. Louis cancelled its parade and implemented restrictions early, resulting in a death rate less than half of Philadelphia's. But even the best public health measures couldn't stop the pandemic entirely. They could only slow it down, spread out the cases so hospitals weren't completely overwhelmed all at once. And the toll on healthcare workers was immense. Doctors worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then got up and worked some more. Nurses stayed on duty for days at a time, catching naps when they could. Medical students were pressed into service before completing their training. Many healthcare workers paid the ultimate price for their dedication. In New York City, the health commissioner reported that the death rate among nurses was 40% higher than in any other group. In Philadelphia, so many doctors fell ill that medical care became nearly impossible to find. The pandemic created ethical dilemmas that no one was prepared for. Who gets the limited hospital beds? Who receives care when there aren't enough doctors to go around? How do you decide which patients to focus on when many are beyond saving? One doctor in Atlantic City, New Jersey, described the impossible choices. I would see a patient in the morning with a fever of 102, and that afternoon it would be 104, and that night the patient would be dead. You didn't need a stethoscope to tell that the patient had pneumonia. You could hear the gurgling as they breathed from the doorway to the bedroom. For ordinary people, the experience of the pandemic varied widely depending on where they lived, their social class, and sheer luck. The wealthy could retreat to country estates, hire private nurses, and generally avoid the worst of the crowded conditions that help spread the disease. The poor, especially in urban tenements, had no such options. In immigrant neighborhoods in American cities, where large families often lived in a single room, the flu spread like wildfire. In coal mining towns where men worked in close quarters deep underground and lived in company housing above, entire communities were devastated. Rural areas had the advantage of natural social distancing, but suffered from lack of medical care. On your Kansas farm, the nearest doctor might be miles away, reachable only by horse or automobile over rough roads. If someone fell seriously ill, they might die before help could arrive. The pandemic altered daily life in countless ways, large and small. Schools closed, church services were suspended, weddings were postponed, funerals became brief, sparsely attended affairs, if they happened at all. In many cities, ordinances limited the number of customers allowed in stores at one time. Shoppers were encouraged to point at what they wanted rather than handling merchandise. Some stores eliminated exchange privileges and insisted on exact change to minimize physical contact. Public transportation became a source of particular anxiety. Streetcars and subway cars were seen as perfect environments for spreading disease, enclosed spaces where people were packed tightly together. Some cities required windows to remain open on public transit, regardless of weather, leading to the peculiar sight of commuters riding in winter coats and gloves in heated cars with all windows wide open. Telephone companies placed notices in newspapers asking people to limit calls to cases of necessity because so many operators were out sick. Mail delivery became sporadic for the same reason. Garbage went uncollected. Basic services that people took for granted became unreliable or disappeared altogether. For children, the pandemic created an eerie, extended holiday from school, but one without play dates, without library visits, without any of the usual pleasures of childhood freedom. Many were confined to their homes for weeks or months, allowed out only for essential errands. One child later recalled, "It was like the whole world went quiet. No school bell, no church on Sunday, no children playing in the street. Just silence, except when the death wagons came through." The psychological impact was profound. People described a pervasive sense of doom, a feeling that the end of the world might be at hand. With death seemingly random and ever-present, many turned to religion for comfort. Others indulged in gallows humour, with children jumping rope to rhymes about the flu, and adults sharing dark jokes about undertakers being the only ones thriving. One aspect of the pandemic that particularly affected mental health was the loneliness. With public gatherings banned and even family visits discouraged, many people faced the crisis in isolation. Those who lived alone might go days without speaking to another human being. Those caring for sick family members were often cut off from outside support due to fear of contagion. A woman in Baltimore wrote in her diary, "The hardest part isn't the fear or even the sickness itself. It's the terrible aloneness of it all. No one comes to visit. No one stops by with food or to check if we need anything. It's as if the entire city is holding its breath, waiting for the angel of death to pass over." The loss of traditional mourning rituals compounded the trauma. Funerals were limited or banned entirely. Bodies were sometimes buried in mass graves with no ceremony at all. The comforting presence of community that normally helps people process grief was absent, leaving survivors to deal with their losses in isolation. One public health nurse in Boston described finding a young boy sitting alone on a curb. When she asked why he was out alone, he replied that everyone in his house was sick and he was afraid to go home. "I ain't got no place to go," he told her. There were countless stories like this. Children orphaned, elderly people left with no one to care for them, entire family networks destroyed in a matter of weeks. By early November, there are signs that the second wave of the pandemic is finally waning in some places. The daily death counts in major cities begin to decrease. Hospital admissions drop. Schools in some areas cautiously reopen. You notice fewer black crepe ribbons on doors as you make your weekly trip into town. The general store is busier, the atmosphere less tense. People still wear masks, still keep their distance, but the raw fear has subsided somewhat. The newspaper reports that the worst seems to be over. The army training camps that were devastated in September and October are returning to normal operations. There's talk of victory celebrations for the war. Germany seems on the verge of surrender, and indeed, on November 11th, 1918, the Great War officially ends with the signing of the armistice. After 4 years of unprecedented slaughter, the guns fall silent across Europe. In many cities, people pour into the streets to celebrate, ignoring public health warnings about large gatherings. Soldiers and sailors on leave join civilians in impromptu parades. Strangers hug and kiss, caught up in the euphoria of peace. Health officials watch these celebrations with dread, expecting a resurgence of flu cases, and in some places that's exactly what happens. The armistice celebrations do trigger local outbreaks, but overall, the pandemic seems to be receding. You and your family cautiously begin to resume normal activities. Your wife attends a meeting of her sewing circle for the first time in months. Your children return to school, though attendance is still spotty, as some parents keep their kids home out of lingering fear. Church services resume, with every other pew left empty for social distancing. Life is slowly returning to something resembling normalcy. The constant fear that has been your companion since September begins to fade. You start to believe you might have made it through the worst of the pandemic unscathed. Then, in mid-December, your neighbour's youngest daughter develops a fever. Within days, cases are spiking again throughout the county. The third wave of the Spanish flu has arrived. This wave isn't as deadly as the second. The virus seems to have lost some of its virulence. But it's still far more dangerous than ordinary seasonal influenza. And people are exhausted, their resilience worn thin by months of fear and loss. The resources to fight this new wave are depleted. Fewer doctors, fewer nurses, less community compliance with restrictions that seem to go on forever. December 1918 into January 1919 sees the pandemic surge again across much of the world. In some places, like Australia, which had largely escaped the second wave due to strict maritime quarantines, the third wave is actually worse than previous ones. The pattern of the disease remains the same. The sudden onset of symptoms, the rapid progression to pneumonia in severe cases, the cyanosis that signals impending death, but medical personnel have learned a bit more about how to manage it. They know now that aspirin helps with the fever, but can be dangerous in excessive doses. They've learned that fresh air seems beneficial for patients. They understand the importance of rest and hydration. These small advances in treatment, combined with the apparently reduced virulence of the virus itself, mean that the death toll of the third wave is lower than that of the catastrophic second wave, but it's still far deadlier than any ordinary flu season. Your family hunkers down again, returning to the cautious isolation of October and November. Christmas is a subdued affair. No large family gathering, no church service, just a quiet celebration at home. New Year's passes with little fanfare. You hope that 1919 will bring an end to both war and pandemic, allowing life to truly return to normal. January brings bitter cold to Kansas. Snow blankets the fields and the wind howls around the corners of your farmhouse. Inside, huddled around the wood stove, your family passes the long winter evenings with books, cards, and conversation. You still scan the newspaper for reports of the flu, still feel that flutter of fear when one of your children coughs, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the grip of terror loosens. The lists of the ill and dead grow shorter each week. By the end of January, there are signs that this third wave, too, is beginning to recede. In cities across America, theaters and restaurants reopen, schools resume normal schedules, churches fill again on Sundays. Slowly, cautiously, life begins to reassert itself over death. But the pandemic has left deep scars. Nearly every community has lost members. Nearly every family has been touched by grief, if not directly then through friends and neighbours. The sheer scale of death, coming so soon after the massive casualties of the war, creates a kind of collective trauma. And for those who survived serious cases of the flu, recovery isn't always complete. Many are left with long-term health problems, heart and lung damage, neurological issues, depression. Some describe a bone-deep fatigue that persists for months, making it difficult to return to normal activities. One survivor wrote, "I was not the same person after the flu. My body recovered more or less, but something in my spirit remained damaged. I had seen too much death, felt too close to my own mortality. The carefree young woman I had been before the pandemic was gone forever." Medical professionals, too, carry the scars of their experience. Many suffer from what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness. Having witnessed so much death, having been so powerless to prevent it, leaves a lasting mark on their psyches. A doctor in New York later recalled, "For years afterward, the sound of coughing in a crowded room would make me break out in a cold sweat. I would look around, scanning faces for that telltale flush, that look in the eyes that meant the Spanish flu had returned." Nurses, who had held the hands of countless dying patients, who had wrapped more bodies than they could remember, reported similar reactions. One nurse said she could never again wear the blue uniform she'd worked in during the pandemic. The sight of it hanging in her closet would trigger panic attacks. As January turns to February and February to March, the third wave of the pandemic continues to weaken. By April 1919, it has largely subsided in most of North America and Europe, though it continues to affect some parts of the world into 1920. The final death toll is impossible to calculate precisely. Record keeping was spotty in many areas, and the chaos of the pandemic itself meant that many deaths went unreported. Modern estimates range from 50 million to 100 million worldwide, more than died in both world wars combined. In the United States, approximately 675,000 people died from the Spanish flu at a time when the total US population was just over 100 million. That's the equivalent of over 2 million deaths in today's America. It's difficult to comprehend loss on that scale. As spring returns to your Kansas farm, you find yourself taking stock. Your family has survived intact, a blessing not granted to so many others. The fields are greening, the animals healthy, the house still standing. In material terms, you've weathered the pandemic relatively well. But the world has changed, and so have you. You look at your neighbours differently now, aware of how quickly community bonds can fray in the face of fear. You look at your children differently, with a sharper awareness of their fragility. You look at the future differently, less certain of what it might hold. The Great War and the Great Pandemic, coming one right after the other and overlapping for months, have shaken the foundations of society. Old certainties have been destroyed. Old hierarchies have been challenged. The world of 1919 is not the world of 1917 and can never be again. As you plant your spring crops, as you repair fences and mend harnesses and go about the business of farming, you wonder what this new world will bring. The pandemic is receding, but its echoes will reverberate for generations. And in a strange twist of history, those echoes will grow fainter rather than stronger with time. Unlike the Great War, which will be memorialized in monuments and ceremonies and literature, the Spanish flu will fade from public memory with surprising speed. Perhaps the trauma was too great, the loss too enormous to dwell upon. Perhaps in the joy of survival, in the rush to rebuild and move forward, the pandemic will become something people simply don't want to remember. But for now, as you watch your children playing in the spring sunshine, as you feel the warm earth between your fingers and the breeze on your face, you're simply grateful. Grateful to be alive, to be healthy, to have your family around you. Grateful that the shadow of the pandemic is finally lifting, allowing light to return to the world. Spring 1919 brings a world eager to heal, desperate to move forward after years of war and disease. The fields around your Kansas farm burst with new life, green shoots pushing through dark soil, wildflowers dotting the pastures, birds returning from their winter journeys. Nature, at least, seems untroubled by the calamities that have befallen humanity. You stand at the edge of your property, watching your children help with the spring planting. The simple sight of them, healthy, alive, faces turned up to the sun, still feels like a miracle after the darkness of the past year. So many other parents weren't so fortunate. In town, storefronts that were shuttered during the height of the pandemic have reopened. The general store is fully stocked again, with shoppers browsing without masks for the first time in months. The local diner has tables full of customers, their conversations creating a buzz that spills out onto the street. Schools are in session, churches holding regular services. On the surface, life appears to be returning to normal, but beneath that veneer of normalcy, profound changes are taking place. In medicine, in society, in the human psyche itself. The pandemic has left America and the world permanently altered. Some changes are immediately visible. The thousands of orphaned children, the young widows and widowers, the gaps in family photos where loved ones once stood. Other changes are more subtle. New public health practices, shifting attitudes toward medicine, evolving social norms. For the medical profession, the Spanish flu represented both a catastrophic failure and an opportunity for growth. Doctors and scientists had been largely helpless against the virus, unable to prevent its spread or effectively treat its victims. This humbling experience spurred a new dedication to understanding infectious diseases. Research into influenza accelerated dramatically. Scientists became determined to identify the pathogen responsible for the pandemic, though it would take until the 1930s before the influenza virus was finally isolated. The pandemic also highlighted the need for better public health infrastructure, better training for healthcare workers, and better coordination between different levels of government. In the aftermath, many cities expanded their health departments. Nursing schools saw increased enrollment as the crucial role of nurses during the pandemic brought new respect to the profession. The concept of preventive medicine gained traction, with more emphasis on stopping diseases before they started rather than just treating them after the fact. For ordinary people like you, the pandemic changed daily habits in subtle but significant ways. Handkerchiefs, once a standard accessory, began to fall out of favour as their role in spreading germs became better understood. Spitting in public, once common, became increasingly taboo. Personal hygiene took on new importance, with regular hand washing emphasised as never before. The Spanish flu also changed how people thought about disease itself. Before 1918, many still viewed illness as a matter of personal constitution or moral failing. If you got sick, it was because you were weak or had done something wrong. The pandemic made it impossible to maintain this fiction, when perfectly healthy young adults could be struck down in days, when entire families fell ill regardless of their character or habits. It became clear that disease was a biological process that could affect anyone. This shift in understanding had far-reaching implications. If disease wasn't a moral punishment but a natural phenomenon that could be studied and potentially prevented, then society had a responsibility to protect public health. The groundwork was laid for many of the public health initiatives that would follow in the coming decades. For your family on the Kansas farm, life gradually settles into new patterns. You still scan the newspaper for reports of influenza outbreaks, still feel a moment of anxiety when one of your children sniffles or coughs, but day by day the immediate fear recedes. One warm Sunday in May, your community holds a memorial service for all those lost to the pandemic. Nearly everyone in the county attends, gathering in the town square rather than the church to allow for more space. The pastor reads the names of the dead, a painfully long list for such a small community, and there's hardly a dry eye to be found. After the service, there's a community meal, the first large gathering since the pandemic began. People are hesitant at first, maintaining old habits of distance, but gradually the ice breaks. There's something healing about being together again, about shared food and conversation and the simple human connection that was denied for so long. An elderly woman who lost both her son and daughter-in-law to the flu sits with her orphaned grandchildren, accepting casseroles and condolences from neighbours. The local doctor, looking a decade older than he did a year ago, receives quiet thanks from families he helped through the crisis. Young men who returned from the war find community support for their adjustment back to civilian life. It's a day of both mourning and celebration, grieving for what's been lost while affirming that life continues. The wounds are still fresh, but the healing has begun. As spring turns to summer, economic recovery becomes the focus across America. The pandemic, coming on the heels of the war, had disrupted nearly every sector of the economy. Workers had fallen ill or died, production had slowed or stopped, supply chains had been broken. Now it was time to rebuild. The economic impact of the Spanish flu was substantial but complex. Some businesses, pharmacies, funeral homes, makers of health products had actually thrived during the pandemic. Others had been devastated. Theatres, restaurants, hotels, and other businesses that relied on public gatherings had suffered tremendous losses. Many small businesses had closed permanently after their owners died or their customer base disappeared. In urban centres, labour shortages became a significant issue. So many working-age adults had died that employers struggled to find enough workers. This led to increased wages in many sectors as businesses competed for the reduced labour pool. For workers who survived, this often meant better pay and conditions than they'd had before. The pandemic also accelerated certain economic trends that had already been underway. Mail-order businesses, for instance, saw a boom as people avoided shopping in person. Telephone usage increased dramatically as people sought to stay connected while physically distant. These changes would continue to shape commerce in the post-pandemic years. For farmers like you, the economic picture was mixed. Food prices had risen during the pandemic due to disruptions in production and distribution, which meant better prices for your crops. But farm labour had become scarcer and more expensive. Equipment and supplies cost more. The overall agricultural economy remained volatile as it adjusted to peacetime production after years of wartime demand. By mid-1919, however, economic recovery is well underway across much of America. Factories are running at full capacity again. Construction projects that were halted during the pandemic have resumed. Consumer spending is increasing as people emerge from the shadow of fear, eager to enjoy life again. This economic resurgence will continue to build through the early 1920s, eventually becoming the boom period known as the Roaring Twenties. The war and the pandemic created pent-up demand for goods and services, while also disrupting traditional social structures and attitudes. The result is an era of unprecedented prosperity and cultural change, at least for those who can participate in it. For many Americans, the pandemic reinforced a carpe diem attitude. Life is short and unpredictable, so enjoy it while you can. This mindset helped fuel the hedonistic aspects of the 1920s, the speakeasies during Prohibition, the dance crazes, the sexual liberation, the general atmosphere of living for the moment. You notice this change even in your rural community. The young people seem more restless, less willing to accept the constraints of tradition. Girls who would have been condemned for wearing makeup or short skirts before the war now do so openly. Boys who would have followed their fathers into farming or local trades are heading to cities, seeking new opportunities and experiences. Your own children are growing up in this changing world. Your oldest, now approaching adulthood, talks about possibilities that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. College, perhaps, or a job in the city, travel to places you've only read about, a life different from the one you've known. You find yourself less resistant to these ideas than you might have been before the pandemic. Having faced the fragility of life so directly, you understand the desire to make the most of it, and you've seen enough of the world changing to know that clinging to the past isn't always possible or desirable. The summer of 1919 brings both celebration and tension. Soldiers returning from Europe are reintegrated into civilian life, bringing with them new perspectives and sometimes new problems. Veterans who had witnessed the horrors of trench warfare, who had seen friends blown apart by artillery or suffocated by poison gas, carry invisible wounds alongside their physical ones. Many of these men had also experienced the pandemic while in military service. Some had fallen ill themselves in crowded camps or transport ships. Others had watched comrades die of influenza after surviving the dangers of combat. The dual trauma of war and pandemic left scars that would never fully heal. Society struggles to address these challenges. There are no formal programs for what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Veterans are largely expected to readjust on their own, to put the war behind them and move forward without complaint. Many turn to alcohol for relief, contributing to the social problems that will eventually lead to prohibition. Racial tensions also flare in the summer of 1919, so severely that the period becomes known as the Red Summer. Race riots erupt in more than 36 cities across the United States, with particularly severe violence in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Elaine, Arkansas. Returning black veterans who had fought for democracy abroad find they're still denied basic rights at home, creating a volatile situation. While the pandemic didn't directly cause these tensions, it contributed to the overall social instability of the period. Communities already strained by disease, death, and economic disruption had fewer resources, material or psychological, to manage other challenges. The result was a society in flux, with old certainties crumbling and new realities not yet fully formed. In your rural Kansas community, these broader social upheavals feel distant but not entirely absent. The local newspaper carries reports of urban unrest. Veterans in your town sometimes gather to share experiences that civilians can never fully understand. Prohibition is debated in the general store and after church services, with opinions sharply divided. Through it all, the memory of the pandemic begins to fade with surprising speed. People rarely speak of it directly, as if by tacit agreement. When they do, it's often in vague terms, that terrible flu or the sickness, rather than detailed recollections. This collective amnesia is puzzling given the scale of the catastrophe. The Spanish flu killed more Americans in a few months than died in all the wars of the 20th century combined. Yet while war memorials will be erected in town squares across the nation, the victims of the pandemic receive no such recognition. Why this erasure? Partly perhaps because the pandemic lacked the narrative elements that make for enduring public memory. War has clear enemies, clear heroes, clear beginning and ending points. The flu arrived mysteriously, killed indiscriminately, and departed gradually, leaving no opportunity for triumph or catharsis. The speed and anonymity of the deaths also made them harder to process and memorialize. Bodies were often buried quickly, without proper funerals. Mass graves were used in the hardest-hit areas. The rituals that normally help societies acknowledge and integrate loss were disrupted or absent entirely. And the pandemic was overshadowed by the war in public consciousness. The Great War had dominated headlines for years, had been the focus of propaganda and patriotic fervour. It had clear geopolitical significance and had mobilised entire nations toward a common goal. The flu, by contrast, was seen almost as a natural disaster, tragic but without larger meaning or purpose. For individual survivors, though, the memory remains vivid. You still wake sometimes in the night, heart pounding, from dreams of crowded sick rooms and gasping breaths. Your wife still counts her children with her eyes when they gather for dinner, a habit formed during those months when every fever might have meant death. The local doctor still flinches slightly when patients cough. The undertaker still has nightmares about rows of bodies waiting for coffins that hadn't yet been built. The teacher still notes the empty desks where students once sat, though she's careful not to mention their names. These private memories exist alongside the public forgetting, creating a strange disconnect between individual experience and collective history. It's as if everyone has agreed to look forward rather than back, to focus on rebuilding rather than remembering. By fall 1919, a year after the pandemic's deadliest wave, life has achieved a new kind of normal. Schools are in full session, businesses are thriving, social gatherings have resumed without restriction. The influenza still circulates, there are local outbreaks here and there. But it has returned to its usual seasonal pattern and level of severity. The virus that caused the pandemic didn't disappear, it evolved. The particular strain that had been so lethal gradually mutated into less deadly forms, still causing illness but rarely the catastrophic pneumonia and cyanosis of 1918. This is the typical pattern for pandemic influenza viruses, which tend to become less virulent over time as they adapt to their human hosts. Scientists today believe that descendants of the 1918 virus continue to circulate as seasonal influenza, causing regular winter outbreaks but never again reaching the pandemic's level of mortality. In a sense, humanity and the virus reached a kind of détente. Not peace exactly, but a less destructive coexistence. For your family, the fall of 1919 brings a return to familiar rhythms. The harvest keeps everyone busy from dawn to dusk. Apples are picked, preserved, and baked into pies. Corn is brought in from the fields. Pumpkins ripen for Halloween. These seasonal tasks, unchanged for generations, provide a comforting continuity after the disruptions of war and pandemic. Your children return to school with new appreciation for the opportunity. The local schoolhouse is fuller than it was last year, but still has fewer students than before the pandemic. Some families moved away after losing breadwinners. Some children were orphaned and sent to live with relatives elsewhere. Some simply never recovered from serious cases of the flu and remained too weak to attend. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, has changed as well. Always stern but fair, she now shows a gentler side, a new patience with childish mistakes and misbehaviour. Having seen how quickly life can be snatched away, she seems determined to make her classroom a place of both learning and kindness. Churches, too, reflect the pandemic's impact. Sermons less frequently threaten divine punishment, more often emphasise God's comfort in times of suffering. Attendance is higher than before, with many finding renewed faith after confronting mortality so directly. Others, who lost faith during the pandemic, stay away, asking how a loving God could permit such widespread suffering. The most visible changes, though, are in public health practices. Schools now send children home at the first sign of illness. Hand-washing stations have been installed in public buildings. Spittoons, once ubiquitous, are disappearing from businesses and homes alike. People cover their coughs and sneezes as a matter of course, where once they might have thought nothing of it. These practical measures reflect deeper shifts in understanding. The pandemic demonstrated in the most brutal way possible how interconnected human health could be, how one person's illness could quickly become an entire community's crisis. This recognition would eventually lead to more robust public health systems, though the process would take decades and remain incomplete. For medical science, the pandemic presented both a humbling failure and a vital learning opportunity. Despite all the advances of modern medicine, doctors in 1918-1919 had been largely helpless against the virus. No effective treatments, no vaccines, limited understanding of how the disease spread or why it affected some patients so much more severely than others. This failure spurred renewed efforts to understand influenza and other infectious diseases. Though the influenza virus itself wouldn't be isolated until the 1930s, the groundwork was laid in the years immediately following the pandemic. Research funding increased. New laboratories were established. Medical education placed greater emphasis on public health and preventive medicine. The pandemic also accelerated the transition from the older miasma theory of disease, the idea that illness was caused by bad air or environmental factors, to the germ theory, the understanding that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases. While the germ theory had been scientifically established before 1918, the pandemic helped cement it in both medical practice and public consciousness. In nursing, the pandemic's legacy was particularly significant. Nurses had been on the front lines, providing most of the direct patient care when doctors were overwhelmed or ineffective. Their crucial role gained new recognition, leading to improved training programs, better working conditions, and greater professional respect. Nursing began its long journey from being seen as women's natural nurturing instinct to being recognized as a skilled profession requiring specific education and expertise. For your wife and the other women in your community, the combined impact of war and pandemic created both new burdens and new opportunities. With so many men away fighting or laid low by illness, women had taken on roles previously closed to them, running businesses, managing farms, working in factories. Though many returned to traditional domestic roles after the crisis passed, the experience of greater independence changed expectations permanently. The 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, will be ratified in August 1920. While the suffrage movement had been building for decades, some historians argue that women's contributions during the war and pandemic years helped overcome remaining resistance. Having proven their capabilities in crisis, women could more effectively claim full citizenship in its aftermath. These social changes reverberate even in your conservative rural community. Women speak more confidently at town meetings, girls discuss career ambitions alongside marriage prospects. The local bank has hired its first female teller, a war widow, who needs to support her children. Small shifts, perhaps, but significant ones in the context of the time. As 1919 draws to a close, you take stock of how your world has changed. Materially, much looks the same. The farm, the town, the familiar landscape of fields and streams. But beneath the surface, everything feels different. Your sense of security, your understanding of what life might bring, your very conception of society and its obligations, all transformed by the twin crucibles of war and pandemic. You've learned that civilization is both stronger and more fragile than you ever realized, stronger in its ability to endure catastrophic losses and still continue functioning, more fragile in how quickly it can be brought to the brink of collapse by invisible enemies. You've learned about human nature in all its complexity, the selfishness of those who hoarded supplies or fled infected areas, the heroism of doctors and nurses who worked until they collapsed, the quiet courage of ordinary people caring for sick family members despite the risk to themselves. The pandemic revealed the worst and best of humanity, often side by side. And you've learned about grief, how it can be both intensely personal and collectively experienced, how it changes over time without ever completely disappearing, how it can break people or somehow make them stronger, the empty places at dinner tables across the country, the children growing up without parents, the parents who buried children. These losses have permanently altered the emotional landscape of a generation. As winter settles over Kansas once more, bringing short days and long nights, you find yourself reflecting on survival itself. What does it mean to have lived when so many died? What responsibilities come with being among those left to rebuild? What lessons should be carried forward to prevent such catastrophes in the future? These questions have no easy answers, but they shape the world emerging from the shadow of the pandemic, a world simultaneously mourning what was lost and striving toward what might be, a world determined in many ways not to repeat the mistakes that made the pandemic so deadly, even as the specific memories of those mistakes begin to fade from public consciousness. In your farmhouse, warmed by the wood stove and lit by kerosene lamps, your family gathers for the evening. The children do homework or play quiet games. Your wife mends clothes by the fireside. Outside, snow begins to fall, blanketing the fields in pristine white. This simple domestic scene, so ordinary, so precious, is the pandemic's greatest legacy. Life, continuing, families, healing, communities, rebuilding, the basic human resilience that allows us to endure calamity and still find meaning, still create beauty, still plan for futures we can't predict or control. As you watch your children's faces in the firelight, you know that they will carry this history forward, shaped by events they may barely remember, but which have formed the world they will inhabit. And in that knowledge is both sadness and hope, the dual inheritance of all who survive catastrophe. The Spanish flu will soon fade from headlines and history books, becoming a footnote rather than the central story of its era. But its impact will continue to ripple through medicine, through public health, through social structures and individual psyches. Like all truly transformative events, it changes the course of history in ways both obvious and subtle, recognized and unrecognized. And as the world moves into the 1920s, with all the cultural ferment and economic boom that decade will bring, the memory of the pandemic will be both buried and preserved, forgotten publicly but remembered privately, an invisible current running beneath the surface of the roaring 20s and beyond. As 1920 dawns, America stands at the threshold of a remarkable decade. The war is over. The worst of the pandemic has passed. A new era is beginning, one that will eventually be known as the Roaring Twenties, a time of unprecedented prosperity, cultural change, and social experimentation. For your family on the Kansas farm, the transition is more gradual. Rural life moves at its own pace, less susceptible to the rapid changes sweeping through urban America. But even here, the influence of the new decade makes itself felt in 100 small ways. Your oldest son, who served briefly in the army before the war ended, has developed a restlessness that farm life can't satisfy. He talks about automobiles, about moving to Kansas City or even Chicago, about opportunities in manufacturing or sales. The pandemic showed him how quickly life could end, and he's determined to experience more of the world while he can. Your daughter, now in her late teens, has bobbed her hair, a shocking fashion statement in your conservative community. She reads magazines that come through the mail-order catalogue, studies the advertisements for cosmetics and ready-made clothing, dreams of a different kind of life than her mother has known. The local boys no longer seem to interest her. She has her sights set on bigger horizons. Even your younger children show the influence of changing times. They use slang terms you've never heard before, picked up from schoolmates whose families have radios. They beg for store-bought toys, advertised in catalogues rather than being content with homemade playthings. They ask questions about the world beyond the farm, questions you sometimes struggle to answer. Your wife, too, has been changed by the experiences of recent years. Having managed the farm almost single-handedly during your brief illness with the flu, she's developed a confidence in her abilities that quietly transforms your marriage. Decisions that once would have been yours alone are now discussed, with her insights given equal weight. She's joined the local women's club where they discuss not just recipes and household tips, but also politics, now that women's suffrage has become law. These changes in your immediate family reflect broader transformations happening across America. The combined trauma of war and pandemic has left people questioning old certainties, old ways of living. The younger generation especially seems determined to break with tradition, to create something new from the ashes of the old world. In cities, this manifests as the vibrant, sometimes chaotic energy of the early 1920s. Jazz music spills from clubs and dance halls. Women shed restrictive clothing for shorter skirts and lighter fabrics. Prohibition, intended to curb alcohol consumption, instead gives rise to speakeasies and bootlegging, adding an element of rebellious excitement to urban nightlife. consumer culture explodes as mass production makes previously luxury items available to the middle class. Automobiles, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, radios, these modern marvels transform daily life for millions of Americans. Advertising becomes increasingly sophisticated, creating not just awareness of products but desire for them, linking consumption to identity in ways that would have been foreign to previous generations. For many, this consumer boom represents a direct response to the deprivations and fear of the pandemic years. Having faced death so intimately, so recently, people are eager to embrace life, to indulge in pleasures and experiences previously denied or delayed. The shadow of mortality that hung over 1918 and 1919 creates in its absence a determined hedonism, a seize-the-day mentality that fuels both economic growth and cultural experimentation. Live for today because tomorrow isn't guaranteed becomes an unspoken motto for the generation that survived the Spanish flu. For those who watched friends and family members die within days of falling ill, who lived through the helplessness and horror of the pandemic's peak, normal concerns about propriety or prudence sometimes seem absurd. Life is short. Why not dance to jazz music? Why not wear lipstick? Why not buy that automobile on the installment plan? This attitude helps drive the economic boom that characterizes much of the 1920s. Consumer spending reaches unprecedented levels. The stock market soars, new industries emerge and established ones expand. Unemployment remains low while wages rise, creating a broad-based prosperity that, while not universal, touches more Americans than ever before. The pandemic contributes to this economic transformation in other ways as well. The massive death toll, particularly among young working-age adults, creates labour shortages in many sectors. Employers must offer higher wages and better conditions to attract workers, accelerating trends toward improved labour standards that had begun before the war. Women who took on new economic roles during both the war and the pandemic don't entirely return to the domestic sphere. By 1920, women make up nearly a quarter of the American workforce, though most work in traditionally feminine occupations, teaching, nursing, clerical positions. Their continued presence in paid employment represents a significant shift from pre-war patterns. For African Americans, the combined impact of war, pandemic, and economic opportunity triggers the beginning of the Great Migration, the mass movement of Black Americans from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North and Midwest. Though driven primarily by economic factors and escape from Jim Crow oppression, the pandemic plays a role by creating job openings in northern factories and disrupting traditional southern agricultural systems. These population movements, women into the workforce, African Americans to northern cities, rural people to urban centers, reshape American society in profound ways. New communities form, new cultural expressions emerge, new political coalitions develop. The America of 1925 would be barely recognizable to someone from 1915, though only a decade has passed. Through it all, the specific memory of the Spanish flu continues to fade from public consciousness with remarkable speed. By the mid-1920s, it's rarely mentioned in newspapers or political speeches. No national monuments are erected to its victims. No annual observances mark its anniversary. Even in medical literature, references to the pandemic decrease steadily as new concerns take precedence. This collective amnesia puzzles later historians who struggle to understand how an event of such magnitude could be so thoroughly forgotten. Various theories are proposed: that the pandemic was overshadowed by the war, that its horror was too great to dwell upon, that its seeming randomness made it difficult to incorporate into national narratives, that the lack of effective treatments left medical professionals reluctant to emphasize their failures. Whatever the reasons, the Spanish flu becomes, for most of the 20th century, a footnote rather than a central event in American history. People who lived through it rarely discuss it, even with their own children. When they do, it's often in vague terms that fail to convey the true scale and impact of what happened. For survivors like you, though, the memory remains vivid, if seldom shared. Certain sounds, a particular quality of cough, the laboured breathing of someone with pneumonia, can instantly transport you back to those terrible months when death stalked every household. Certain smells, carbolic acid, camphor, the distinct odour of high fever, trigger flashbacks that leave you momentarily disoriented, caught between past and present. And there are physical reminders as well. Some survivors never fully recover their health, suffering from what doctors variously call post-influenzal neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion, or simply chronic invalidism. Modern researchers would recognize these as possible cases of post-viral syndrome or myalgic encephalomyelitis, but in the 1920s, such conditions are poorly understood and often dismissed as psychosomatic. Other survivors develop heart problems, lung damage, or neurological issues that persist for years or decades after their acute illness. A study in the 1920s finds that people who had been seriously ill with the flu show higher rates of Parkinson's disease and other neurological conditions years later, though the connection isn't well understood at the time. Even those who escape long-term physical effects often carry psychological scars. Depression is common among survivors, especially those who lost multiple family members. So is a peculiar kind of fatalism, a sense that life is fundamentally unpredictable and that long-term planning is pointless. Some develop what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, with symptoms triggered by illness in themselves or loved ones. For healthcare workers who served during the pandemic, the psychological impact is particularly severe. Many doctors and nurses suffer from what one physician describes as a form of shell shock, similar to what soldiers experience in combat. They have nightmares about overflowing wards, about patients turning blue and gasping for breath, about the helplessness of watching people die despite their best efforts. Some leave medicine entirely, unable to continue in a profession that exposed them to such trauma. Others develop a grim humour as a coping mechanism, a tendency to joke about death that outsiders find disturbing, but that helps them manage their memories. Still, others throw themselves into research or public health work, determined to ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again. The pandemic's influence on medicine and public health is perhaps its most significant lasting legacy. Though forgotten by the general public, the Spanish flu leaves an indelible mark on how healthcare is practiced, how diseases are studied, and how public health emergencies are managed. In the 1920s, numerous cities and states expand their public health departments, hiring specialized personnel and developing better systems for disease surveillance and response. The pandemic made painfully clear how quickly infectious disease could spread through modern communities and how essential coordinated action was to controlling outbreaks. Medical education evolves to place greater emphasis on infectious diseases and preventive medicine. Nursing schools expand their curricula to include more science and public health content. Research funding increases for studies of influenza and other respiratory diseases, laying groundwork that will eventually lead to flu vaccines, antiviral medications, and better treatments for pneumonia. The pandemic also influences hospital design and medical practice in subtle ways. The value of isolation for preventing disease spread, the importance of ventilation in patient wards, the need for adequate reserve capacity in healthcare systems, lessons learned at terrible cost in 1918-1919, gradually become standard considerations in healthcare planning. For your family and community, these larger trends manifest in smaller, more personal ways. The local doctor, who worked himself to exhaustion during the pandemic, has taken on a young partner fresh from medical school, the first new physician in the county in decades. The town has established a small health department with a nurse who visits schools regularly to check children for signs of illness and teaches hygiene practices. The hospital in the nearest city has been expanded with a new wing specifically designed for infectious disease patients. It features improved ventilation, private rooms rather than open wards, and special areas where staff can change clothes and clean up before leaving to prevent carrying germs home to their families. Schools now send children home at the first sign of fever or severe cough, a policy that would have seemed excessively cautious before 1918, but now feels like simple common sense. Teachers maintain supplies of soap and paper towels, and hand washing becomes part of the daily routine for students. Windows are kept open whenever weather permits, even in winter, to provide fresh air circulation. Churches, theatres and other public gathering places are designed or retrofitted with better ventilation systems. Spittoons, once ubiquitous in public buildings and many homes, disappear almost entirely, replaced by signs prohibiting spitting as a public health measure. Drinking fountains are redesigned to prevent mouth contact with shared surfaces. These practical changes reflect deeper shifts in understanding about disease and public health. The pandemic demonstrated in the most brutal way possible that individual health is inseparable from community health, that one person's illness could quickly become everyone's problem. This recognition slowly transforms how Americans think about healthcare, laying early groundwork for more collective approaches that will develop over the coming decades. For your Kansas farm family, daily life in the early 1920s settles into a new rhythm, different from before the pandemic but stable in its own way. Your oldest son has indeed moved to Kansas City, finding work in an automobile factory and sending regular letters describing city life with enthusiasm that makes you both proud and wistful. Your daughter is engaged to a young man from a neighboring county who plans to study agriculture at the state college, a compromise between her dreams of something different and the practical realities of rural life. Your younger children are growing up in a world that feels safer than it did during those terrible months of the pandemic, but also somehow more fragile. They have an awareness, absorbed from the adults around them, that security can be illusory, that everything can change in an instant. It makes them both more cautious and more determined to enjoy each day, a complex legacy of having grown up in the shadow of mass death, even if they were too young to fully understand it at the time. Your wife has become a leader in the local women's club, which has expanded its activities to include public health initiatives alongside its traditional social functions. They organise vaccination drives for children, arrange for the county nurse to give talks on home hygiene, and maintain a small fund to help families dealing with serious illness. It's her way of ensuring that if another health crisis comes, your community will be better prepared. As for you, the pandemic has left you with a deeper appreciation for the rhythms of agricultural life, the predictable cycles of planting and harvest, the close connection to land and weather, the relative self-sufficiency of farm existence. While your children may be drawn to the excitement of the changing world beyond your acres, you find comfort in the continuity of working the same soil your father and grandfather worked before you. Still, even you aren't immune to the transformations of the decade. By the mid-1920s, you've purchased a tractor to replace some of your horse-drawn equipment, a concession to efficiency and changing times. You've installed a telephone, connecting your isolated farmhouse to the wider community in ways previously impossible. You've even, after much deliberation, bought a radio, bringing music and news from across the the country into your living room each evening. These technologies change not just the practical aspects of farm life, but its emotional texture as well. The isolation that once defined rural existence is gradually diminishing. Information travels faster, communication is easier. The sharp divide between country and city begins to blur around the edges. For all the prosperity and innovation of the 1920s, however, there remains an undercurrent of melancholy, a sense of absence that never quite dissipates. Family photographs include empty spaces where loved ones should be. Community gatherings feel incomplete without those who didn't survive. Certain names are spoken with a particular carefulness, as if the very sound of them might reopen old wounds. And beneath the cultural ferment and economic boom of the decade lurks a certain brittleness, a fragility that few acknowledge openly, but many sense intuitively. The pandemic revealed how quickly the foundations of ordinary life could crumble, how suddenly everything taken for granted could vanish. That knowledge can't be unlearned even as life returns to apparent normalcy. Perhaps this explains some of the decade's excesses, the frenetic dancing, the illegal drinking, the speculation in stocks, the obsession with youth and novelty. If nothing is truly secure, why not enjoy the moment? If death can come swiftly and randomly, why defer gratification? If traditional certainties proved hollow, why not experiment with new ways of living? The live for today mentality that helps drive the Roaring Twenties contains within it both liberation and desperation, the freedom to break with constraining traditions, but also an anxiety about what the future might bring. It's the complex psychological legacy of a generation that witnessed unprecedented mass death, whether in the trenches of France or the sick rooms of American homes. As the decade progresses, this undercurrent of anxiety becomes increasingly masked by prosperity and cultural dynamism. The stock market continues to climb, consumer products proliferate, entertainment becomes more elaborate and widely available, art, literature, and music flourish in new and experimental forms. On the surface, America in the mid-1920s appears to have moved beyond the traumas of war and pandemic, embracing a future of unlimited possibility. But the lessons of 1918 to 1919 haven't been forgotten, merely submerged, continuing to shape attitudes, behaviors, and institutions in ways both obvious and subtle. The pandemic's influence can be seen in everything from hospital architecture to public health laws, from patterns of grief to approaches to childcare. It affects how communities respond to seasonal illness, how families make decisions about health, how individuals think about mortality. It's present in 1,000 small adaptations to life after mass death, adaptations so thoroughly incorporated into daily existence that their origins are no longer recognized. And it lives in the bodies and minds of survivors, in your occasional nightmares about crowded sick rooms, in your wife's compulsive checking on sleeping children, in your community's heightened response to any hint of unusual illness. The Spanish flu becomes part of who you are, even as it fades from public memory and historical record. By 1925, newspaper references to the pandemic have become rare. Medical journals focus on new research rather than retrospective analysis. Popular culture, novels, films, radio programs rarely mentions the Spanish flu, despite its enormous impact just a few years earlier. When the pandemic is referenced at all, it's usually as background context rather than central subject, a passing mention rather than a focal point. This silence creates a peculiar disconnect between private experience and public narrative. Millions of Americans carry vivid, traumatic memories of the pandemic, yet almost no one is talking about it publicly. Millions of families have been permanently altered by loss, yet these losses aren't acknowledged in national discourse. An event that killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined receives barely a footnote in contemporary discussions of recent history. The reasons for this collective amnesia remain complex and not entirely understood, even a century later, but its effect is clear. The Spanish flu becomes an invisible catastrophe, a shared trauma that shapes society without being openly discussed or formally remembered. For your family, as for so many others, the pandemic gradually becomes something rarely mentioned but never truly forgotten, a background presence, a defining experience, a dividing line between before and after. Life continues with all its joys and challenges, but always with the awareness that everything can change in an instant, that security is provisional, that every ordinary day is a gift not to be taken for granted. And as the Roaring Twenties progress toward their eventual crash, as new challenges emerge on the horizon, this hard-won wisdom serves as both burden and blessing, a weight of knowledge that no one would choose to carry, but also a deeper appreciation for life's fragility and preciousness that can only come from confronting its transience directly. The prosperity of the mid-1920s carries America forward on a wave of optimism and excess. Stock prices climb to dizzying heights. Consumer spending reaches unprecedented levels. New technologies, automobiles, radios, household appliances transform daily life for millions. The traumatic memories of war and pandemic seem to recede further with each passing year, buried beneath jazz music, Hollywood films, and the intoxicating sense that good times will continue indefinitely. On your Kansas farm, you experience this prosperity in more modest ways. Crop prices are strong. You've gradually modernized your operation. A tractor has replaced some of your horses. Electricity has come to your area. A telephone connects you to neighbors and the wider world. Your children who remained on the farm have better prospects than you did at their age. Those who left for the cities write of exciting opportunities and experiences. But you've lived long enough to know that good times rarely last forever, and beneath the gleaming surface of 1920s America, cracks are beginning to form. Farmers are the first to feel the shift. By the mid-1920s, agricultural prices begin to fall as European production recovers from the war. And American farmers equipped with new machinery produce more than the market can absorb. Farm foreclosures increase, rural banks fail. A depression takes hold in agricultural regions years before it spreads to the rest of the country. For your family, this means tightening your belt, being more careful with expenses, perhaps delaying plans for further improvements to your farm. You've lived through hard times before. The pandemic taught you resilience, if nothing else, but you worry about your children's future in a changing economic landscape. Then comes October 1929. The stock market, which had climbed so high, crashes spectacularly. Fortunes evaporate overnight. Banks collapse. Businesses close. Unemployment soars. The Great Depression descends on America and much of the world, bringing economic hardship on a scale not seen in generations. The Roaring Twenties end not with a whimper, but with a bang, ushering in a decade that will test American resilience in new ways. The generation that survived the pandemic now faces economic disaster, another collective trauma, another fundamental challenge to assumptions about how the world works. For many, the Depression feels like the final act in a trilogy of catastrophes. World War I, the Spanish flu, and now economic collapse. Each has stripped away another layer of security, another basis for confidence in the future. Each has revealed the fragility of systems previously taken for granted. Each has forced ordinary people to confront extraordinary circumstances with whatever resources they can muster. Yet this generation, your generation, finds ways to endure. Having faced death on a massive scale during the pandemic, the material deprivations of the Depression, while serious, don't represent the same existential threat. You've already learned that life can continue after unimaginable loss. You've already developed mechanisms for coping with uncertainty and fear. In some ways, rural families like yours fare better during the early depression than urban dwellers. You can grow your own food, barter with neighbours, make do with less cash. The self-sufficiency that has always characterised farm life becomes a crucial advantage when the cash economy falters. Your children who move to cities sometimes return temporarily, seeking the security of the family farm until urban opportunities improve. Through these new challenges, the memory of the pandemic continues to recede from public consciousness. In a world grappling with mass unemployment and economic collapse, the Spanish flu seems increasingly distant, a calamity from another era despite being only a decade in the past. Few writers or politicians draw connections between these successive crises. Few recognize how one has shaped responses to the next. But for survivors like you, the connections are implicit if rarely articulated. The pandemic taught lessons about impermanence, about the limitations of human control, about the importance of community during crisis, lessons that prove valuable as you navigate the challenges of the Depression. Having faced one existential threat, you approach the next with a hard-won wisdom, a deeper understanding of what truly matters when everything else falls away. And though largely unacknowledged, the Spanish flu's influence continues to shape medicine, public health, and scientific research throughout the Depression years and beyond. The memory of helplessness against the 1918 virus drives efforts to better understand influenza and other infectious diseases, to develop more effective treatments and preventive measures to build healthcare systems better equipped to handle future pandemics. In 1933, scientists finally isolate the influenza virus, an achievement directly inspired by the 1918 pandemic and made possible by research funding and institutional support that grew out of that catastrophe. This breakthrough opens the door to developing vaccines, though effective flu vaccines won't become widely available until the 1940s. Medical education evolves to place greater emphasis on virology, immunology, and public health. Nursing education becomes more standardized and scientifically rigorous. Hospital design incorporates lessons learned during the pandemic about preventing cross-infection and managing patient flows during health crises. Public health departments, expanded and professionalized in the wake of the pandemic, continue their work even as Depression-era budget cuts force difficult choices. Disease surveillance systems improve, allowing faster detection and response to outbreaks. Quarantine protocols become more standardized and evidence-based. International cooperation on health issues increases gradually, laying groundwork for later organizations like the World Health Organization. These developments occur largely out of public view, rarely making headlines or capturing popular imagination, but they represent a crucial legacy of the pandemic, a slow, steady strengthening of humanity's defenses against infectious disease, motivated by the determination that nothing like the Spanish flu should ever happen again. For your family and community, the practical impacts of these advances are mixed. Medical care improves incrementally, but access remains limited, especially during the Depression, when many can't afford even basic health care. Public health measures provide some protection against disease outbreaks, but rural areas still lag behind cities in infrastructure and services. Your local doctor now has sulfur drugs, the first truly effective antibiotics to treat bacterial infections, including the secondary pneumonia that made the Spanish flu so deadly. This represents a revolutionary advance, though penicillin and other more powerful antibiotics won't become widely available until after World War II. Vaccines for diphtheria, tetanus, and other diseases gradually become more common, protecting children from illnesses that once claimed many young lives. Public health campaigns promote better nutrition, sanitation, and personal hygiene, contributing to overall improvements in health outcomes despite economic hardship. These medical and public health advances, while significant, receive little attention compared to the economic and political dramas of the 1930s. The Spanish flu itself is rarely mentioned in newspapers, magazines, or radio programs of the era. No monuments are built to commemorate its victims. No National Day of Remembrance marks its anniversary. The most deadly pandemic in modern history has, within 2 decades of its occurrence, been largely erased from public memory. This erasure is puzzling to later historians who struggle to understand how an event that killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined could so quickly fade from collective consciousness. Various theories are proposed that the pandemic was overshadowed by the war, that its horror was too great to confront directly, that its seeming randomness made it difficult to incorporate into national narratives, that the lack of photographic documentation, compared to the war, made it less present in visual memory. Whatever the reasons, the Spanish flu becomes, for most of the 20th century, a historical footnote rather than a central event in American memory. It's mentioned briefly in medical textbooks, occasionally referenced in personal memoirs, but rarely explored in depth or recognized for its profound impact on society, culture, and individual lives. For survivors like you, this public amnesia creates a strange disconnect between personal experience and collective history. The pandemic that transformed your life, that killed friends and neighbors, that revealed both the fragility of civilization and the resilience of the human spirit, is barely acknowledged in broader cultural discourse. You rarely speak of it yourself. The experience feels too intimate, too painful for casual conversation. When your grandchildren ask about the old days, you tell them about the war, about early automobiles, about farming before tractors, but seldom about the weeks when death stalked every household, when you feared each cough might signal the beginning of the end, when you watched young, healthy people turn blue and die gasping for air within days of falling ill. Some memories are too heavy to share, some experiences too profound to translate into words, and so the Spanish flu becomes a private legacy carried in the bodies and minds of survivors but rarely acknowledged publicly, an invisible current running beneath the surface of American life. By the late 1930s, as another world war looms on the horizon, the generation that survived the pandemic faces yet another global crisis. Those who were young adults in 1918 are now approaching middle age. Their children, born during or after the pandemic, are coming of age in a world shaped by forces they barely understand. Forces including a virus that killed millions but is seldom mentioned in their history books. When World War II erupts, medicine and public health have advanced significantly since 1918. Antibiotics, blood transfusion techniques, improved surgical methods, and better understanding of nutrition and wound care all contribute to higher survival rates for injured soldiers. Public health measures prevent the massive outbreaks of disease that characterized previous wars. And crucially, there is no equivalent to the Spanish flu during or immediately after World War II, though other infectious diseases cause problems in specific theatres of war. Nothing approaches the global catastrophe of 1918-1920. The medical and public health lessons of the pandemic, implemented gradually over the intervening decades, help prevent history from repeating itself in this regard. For your family, now spanning 3 generations, World War II brings new challenges and separations. Grandchildren perhaps serve in the military or work in war industries. Rationing and shortages revive skills of self-sufficiency developed during the Depression. Air raid drills and blackout regulations create a different kind of anxiety than the pandemic did, but one that similarly disrupts normal life and forces adaptation to extraordinary circumstances. Through it all, the Spanish flu remains largely unmentioned, a shared trauma buried beneath layers of subsequent experience, but its influence persists in subtle ways, in how your family approaches illness, in your instinctive understanding of life's fragility, in your appreciation for simple pleasures that others might take for granted. When the war ends in 1945, American society enters a period of unprecedented prosperity and optimism. The post-war economic boom, the baby boom, suburban expansion, technological advances all contribute to a sense that the future is bright and limitless. The generation that lived through pandemic, depression and war can finally exhale, can finally believe that their children and grandchildren might know a more stable, secure world than they did. Medical science continues to advance rapidly during this period. Antibiotics become more diverse and widely available. Vaccines are developed for polio, measles, and other childhood diseases. Hospital systems expand, making healthcare more accessible to ordinary Americans. Public health infrastructure strengthens with better disease surveillance, sanitation, and health education. These developments build on foundations laid in the aftermath of the Spanish flu, though the connection is rarely acknowledged explicitly. The pandemic created an awareness of how vulnerable humanity remained to infectious disease, spurring research and institutional development that would continue for decades, gradually transforming medicine and public health in ways that made the post-war world much safer from the type of catastrophe that struck in 1918. As the survivors of the Spanish flu enter old age in the 1950s and 1960s, their ranks gradually thin. People who experienced the pandemic firsthand pass away, taking their memories with them. With few written accounts, minimal official commemoration, and little incorporation into historical narratives, the first-hand experience of the pandemic begins to disappear from living memory. Your own children and grandchildren know that there was a terrible flu outbreak when you were younger. They've heard occasional references, seen how you react when someone in the family falls seriously ill, perhaps noticed your particular concern about respiratory infections. But they don't truly understand what you lived through, can't fully grasp the scale and intensity of what happened in those terrible months of 1918-1919. And as your generation passes from the scene, the Spanish flu recedes even further from collective awareness. It becomes a distant historical event, mentioned in passing, if at all, its profound impact on society, culture, and individual lives largely forgotten by all except specialized historians and epidemiologists. This forgetting has consequences. When new influenza strains emerge in 1957 and 1968, causing significant but less severe pandemics, few draw connections to 1918 or apply its lessons systematically. When AIDS emerges in the 1980s, presenting a different kind of pandemic, the historical experience of 1918 offers potential insights about social response to disease that remain largely untapped because the earlier pandemic has been so thoroughly forgotten. Not until the early 21st century does the Spanish flu begin to receive the historical attention it deserves. the emergence of new infectious disease threats, SARS, avian influenza, Ebola, prompts renewed interest in past pandemics. Historians and medical researchers begin exploring archives, analysing data, reconstructing the events of 1918 to 1920 with greater precision and depth than ever before. In 2005, scientists successfully reconstruct the 1918 influenza virus using tissue samples preserved from victims, allowing detailed study of what made it so uniquely lethal. Historical analyses reveal the effectiveness of different public health measures implemented during the pandemic, providing evidence-based guidance for future health crises. The Spanish flu gradually emerges from historical shadow, recognized at last for its enormous impact on the 20th century world. And then, in 2020, another respiratory pandemic sweeps the globe. COVID-19 creates eerie echoes of 1918, the rapid spread, the overwhelmed hospitals, the makeshift morgues, the debates over masks and social distancing, the disproportionate impact on certain communities. Suddenly, the Spanish flu feels not like distant history, but like prologue, its lessons urgent and relevant a century after the fact. During COVID-19, knowledge of the Spanish flu helps inform public health responses, provides context for understanding the unfolding crisis, and offers historical perspective on how societies recover from pandemic disasters. The Spanish flu, so long forgotten, becomes a crucial reference point, a source of both cautionary tales and reasons for hope. This belated recognition can't help the millions who died in 1918 to 1920, or the millions more who survived but carried the trauma of that experience throughout their lives. But it does finally acknowledge their suffering and sacrifice, integrating their story into our collective understanding of the modern world and how it came to be. The century-long journey of the Spanish flu, from global catastrophe to historical footnote to rediscovered relevance, reveals something important about how societies process trauma and incorporate difficult experiences into their shared narratives. Some events are so disruptive, so contrary to our preferred vision of progress and control, that they resist integration into collective memory. They become historical blind spots, their influence continuing subterraneously while their explicit memory fades. But eventually, if we're fortunate, these blind spots come back into focus. We recover the lost experiences, recognize their significance, and incorporate their lessons into our understanding of both past and present. The rediscovery of the Spanish flu in recent decades represents such a recovery, an acknowledgement of suffering too long unrecognized, a restoration of historical continuity too long disrupted. For you, of course, the Kansas farmer who lived through the pandemic, who saw friends and neighbors die, who feared for your family's survival, who rebuilt your life in its aftermath, none of this later historical reassessment matters directly. Your experience was what it was, whether historians recognized its significance or not. The pandemic changed you, changed your community, changed your understanding of life's fragility and preciousness, regardless of how it was subsequently remembered or forgotten. But there's a kind of justice in the renewed attention to the Spanish flu, a belated recognition of what you and millions of others endured, the pandemic that shaped your generation, that influenced how you approached subsequent challenges from depression to world war, that left invisible scars carried throughout your life. That pandemic finally takes its place as a pivotal event in modern history, acknowledged for its profound and enduring impact. And in that acknowledgement lies a broader lesson about historical memory and human experience. No catastrophe, however devastating, represents the end of history. Life continues, people rebuild, society recovers. New generations emerge who know the disaster only as a story told by their elders. if they know it at all. The most traumatic events can fade from collective consciousness with surprising speed, buried beneath the accumulating layers of subsequent experience. But the influence of such events persists, often in ways we fail to recognize. The Spanish flu shaped the 20th century in countless ways, from advances in medical science to changes in public health systems, from artistic expressions to economic developments, from family structures to individual psychologies. That its role wasn't acknowledged for decades doesn't diminish its significance. It merely reflects our human tendency to look forward rather than backward, to focus on rebuilding rather than remembering. Perhaps that tendency itself represents a kind of resilience, the ability to absorb catastrophic loss and still continue to face unimaginable suffering and still find meaning, to encounter the darkest aspects of existence and still create beauty. The generation that survived the Spanish flu demonstrated this resilience abundantly, carrying on despite their losses, building the modern world despite their scars. In their example lies both inspiration and caution for our own time. Inspiration in their ability to endure, to adapt, to find new ways forward after devastating loss. Caution in recognizing how easily crucial historical experiences can be forgotten, how readily vital lessons can be lost when we fail to incorporate difficult truths into our collective narrative. The Spanish flu reminds us that pandemics have always been part of human experience, that our ancestors faced challenges as severe as any we encounter today, that resilience in the face of seeming catastrophe is a deeply human quality expressed across generations and cultures. It connects us to those who came before, to you, the Kansas farmer weathering the storms of 1918, and to millions like you around the world who lived through the pandemic and carried its lessons forward, whether acknowledged or not. In that connection lies a profound comfort. We are not the first to face pandemic disease, not the first to know fear and loss on a massive scale, not the first to wonder if life will ever return to normal. Others have walked this path before us. They found their way forward. They rebuilt their lives and communities. They discovered that even after unimaginable tragedy, joy remains possible, beauty remains accessible, love remains transformative. The Spanish flu, so long forgotten and now partially remembered, offers this enduring wisdom across the century that separates us from its devastation. Life is fragile, nothing is guaranteed, everything we cherish can be taken in an instant, and yet knowing all this, we continue, planting crops, raising children, creating art, building communities, finding meaning in both ordinary moments and extraordinary challenges. This is the pandemic's most profound legacy, not just scientific advances or institutional developments, but a deeper understanding of human vulnerability and human resilience, an awareness that we live always on the edge of uncertainty, and that this very uncertainty makes each day precious, each connection valuable, each moment of beauty or love or simple contentment a gift to be treasured. As the sun sets over your Kansas farm, casting long shadows across fields that have sustained your family through pandemic, depression, and war, you understand this truth in your bones. You've seen the worst that life can bring. You've endured losses that once seemed unbearable. You've rebuilt from ruins more than once. And still, you find reasons for gratitude, moments of joy, purpose in your days. This is what it means to survive catastrophe, not to escape unscathed, not to forget what happened, but to carry the experience forward, transformed by it, yet not defined by it, to know darkness intimately and still choose light, to recognize fragility and still risk love, to understand loss and still embrace life. The Spanish flu taught this lesson to your generation. The challenge for those who follow is to remember it without having to learn it again at the same terrible cost, to honour the experience of the pandemic's victims and survivors by keeping their wisdom alive, by recognising their suffering, by acknowledging how their responses to unprecedented challenges helped shape the world we inhabit today. In the end, perhaps that's the best memorial we can offer to those who lived and died during the Spanish flu. Not just monuments or ceremonies, but a genuine effort to understand what they endured, to recognise how it changed them, and to carry forward the hard-won wisdom of their experience. To see them not as distant historical figures, but as people like ourselves, facing the unimaginable with whatever resources they could muster, finding ways to continue despite everything. Their story is our story. Their resilience is our inheritance. Their world, transformed by pandemic, is the foundation of our own. In remembering them, we remember something essential about ourselves, our fragility and our strength, our vulnerability and our courage, our capacity to endure what once seemed unendurable and to rebuild what once seemed irreparably broken. As night falls over your Kansas farm, as stars appear in a sky unchanged since 1918, you rest in this knowledge. Whatever comes next, you have survived the worst. Whatever challenges await, you carry within you the strength forged in humanity's most trying hours. Whatever the future holds, you face it with the quiet resilience of one who has seen darkness and still believes in light. This is the legacy of the Spanish flu, not just death and loss, though these were immense, but the enduring human capacity to continue, to adapt, to find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances, a capacity demonstrated by your generation and available to all who follow whenever and however it may be needed, a capacity that reminds us across the decades that even the darkest night eventually yields to dawn.